For this video, I'm going to be going through each of the rares in the blue color of the core set of Mythgard, and I'm going to talk about whether I would consider crafting these cards if I was a new player, and I'm also going to kind of talk about what decks you would expect to throw these kinds of cards into, the overall power level, etc, etc, just so you get a nice review of the rares in Mythgard. I know that there's a lot of new players joining us, as Mythgard is now in open beta. Hello if you're one of those new players. Mythgard is fantastic. But I'm going to do this as a mini-series. I'll do one video for each of the colors, and I don't want to delay things that much further, so let's just dive right in. And we're going to start with Plagiarist, and just right off the bat, this is not a card I would recommend crafting. It has a very neat effect. It gives you the ability to copy an artifact or enchantment that your opponent has in play, and then add it to your hand, and you don't have a gem cost associated. You do, however, still have to pay the mana, and while it's a cool effect, it's just not a very powerful card. It's not really seeing a lot of play in many of the decks. Even if you're against opposing decks that run a lot of enchantments or artifacts, or even just powerful enchantments or artifacts that you want to copy, this is really difficult to pull off because of the way the game scales. So by the time that they have played anything that you deem worthwhile, that you actually want to copy, right? This is going to be a very weak card. You know, typically you want something that's going to be costing 3, 4, 5. You know, think about things like Serpent's Den, Olama Ring, or you get to things like Stairway to Hades. Those are powerful cards, and copying them is great, but you're going to have to resolve Plagiarist in a lane where it can then breach. So again, this is a small card. It is a 1/2. And it also needs to breach in order to copy, and then even when it copies, you still have to pay for the cards that you've made a copy of. So I like this card because I think it's well balanced. It has a very powerful effect, but it's just not seeing a lot of play right now, I think in large part because of how brittle it is. I could see in the future this being included in some decks as like a tech choice against artifact heavy or against enchantment heavy decks, but as of right now it's not seeing a lot of play, and it's certainly not the sort of thing I would craft if I was a new player, because I want powerful things that are going to go in a lot of decks. So moving on, Singing Stone. This is a card that if you're playing a very specific kind of deck, you will want, and outside of that I wouldn't recommend crafting it. And as a new player I wouldn't recommend crafting it just because, as I said, it's basically going to go in one deck, and that's it. And I think that your essence is better used on cards that are going to go in multiple decks across multiple archetypes. So Singing Stone here, very powerful, and the kind of deck you want this in is in an Earthslide deck, an enchantment heavy deck, and we'll see Earthslide a little bit later. That's another blue rare, but outside of that it just does not see a lot of play. So next up we have Lore Broker. This is a card, if you are playing a lot of blue decks, I would consider crafting. The 2/3 for 2 is a reasonable stat line. 3 health is kind of a tipping point for many minions in Mythgard because of the prevalence of Thunderclap that we'll cover a little bit later, and cards like Magnus. There's a lot of effects that deal 2 damage, is I guess what I'll say. Ignition falls into that category. Even just early game creatures with rush, things like Trapezists, for example. So 3 health is relevant, and the breach is just good enough. You get to see what your opponent's hand is. They have to play with your hand revealed for as long as this is on the board, because it becomes empowered once you breach once. And I mean, information is information. So this kind of becomes like a general all-purpose just 2-drop in blue decks you're running. The only time I'm running a blue deck where I'm not including Lore Broker is if I'm doing something incredibly tribal heavy like Valkyries or something. Outside of that, I throw Lore Broker in just about every blue deck that I run. Noren DataCore. This is a card that used to be a staple, and I think it still has a lot of value, but it was recently nerfed. It was a balance adjusted, if you will, so it does not provide as much temporary mana, but this is still a really powerful card. I think that this is the kind of card that I don't recommend crafting for a new player because, again, it doesn't go into a large number of decks. But if you are very interested in the kinds of decks this goes into, and this is specifically either controlling ramp-oriented decks, or it goes really well in Orpheum decks. I know it seems counterintuitive because the Orpheum is also going to be hurting your durability of the data core, But if you're playing like a red-blue Orpheum deck, being able to make your minions expendable and then also granting you extra mana to follow up with big plays on the next turn, it's actually a pretty cool combo. But overall, it's just not versatile enough for me to recommend crafting, but you can expect to see this. This does see play even after the nerf in some decks. So, you know, be aware of Noren DataCore. It's a powerful card. Next up we have Earthslide. This falls into the same category of Singing Stone in my mind, in that if you want to build the Earthslide deck, this is one where you play a bunch of enchantments so that you're kind of flooding the board. You want to get like 4 or 5 enchantments on the board, and then you play Earthslide to kind of one-stop shop fill your board with bodies. Then yeah, craft Earthslide if that's the deck you want to play. Otherwise, I do not recommend crafting this if you're a new player, because it's just not versatile, and while it can be a powerful effect, it's also a very boom or bust kind of effect. So, you know, be aware that this card exists. Kind of look to see when you're playing against blue enchantment decks, should I expect an Earthslide, how do I counter it, etc, etc. But as far as like crafting goes, unless that's the deck you really want to play, then by all means craft it. But otherwise, I wouldn't recommend it. And I want to be clear as I'm going through these, if there's a card that you just want to play, like, you can go ahead and craft it. I'm not going to tell you how to enjoy your free time, but I'm just speaking from a like most bang for your buck perspective with some of these crafting recommendations. And that brings us to Foss Grimm, who is a great crafting choice if you're going to be playing a lot of blue, because he just goes into a number of decks. 3/4 for 3 is a great stat line. He's got a keyword with regen 1, has a very good awaken ability. Your other friendly minions get a free move action, so basically they all get swift for 1 turn. And this is good in aggressive lists and mid-range lists because you can surprise move things around, take value trades, or surprise move things around and get extra damage in directly to the opponent. So great utility. It's even good in control lists because the regen and the 3/4 stat line means that it can oftentimes trade into something, survive, trade into something, maybe survive again. For example, against snake decks, this can basically trade into a Serpent's Den forever because of the regen 1 unless they do something else. So that's very, very nice. And speaking of Serpent's Den, if you're playing a blue-yellow kind of control deck that also runs Serpent's Den, being able to play this and then move your snakes off of the enchantment so that you guarantee create more next turn is also very valuable. This is just it's a good blue card. I would consider crafting this. It is the sort of thing that will go in a large number of decks. Next up we have Maelstrom. This is like a personal pet project of mine. I don't know why I love this card so much, but I really, really do. I think I enjoy it because from a design standpoint, it really has a cool theme and flavor, and I think it just does things in Mythgard that really highlight the good parts of Mythgard, the lane system and enchantments and positioning. So I like this card and I try to make it work way more than is necessary, but I can't in good faith, even though I love it, recommend crafting this card unless you're trying to build a very specific deck, and I'm going to warn you, it's not even very good. It's fun, but not very good. There is a specific deck where you run like Maelstrom and Field of Poppies to kind of create this kind of permanent board shutdown situation, but it's also very difficult to set up, and it requires your opponent to not have any answers for enchantments whatsoever, and blah, blah, blah. So I can't in good faith recommend this card. It is good. You will run into it from time to time, but just not in a lot of frequency. I think you'll run into it because people are like me and they experiment with it and they want to have fun with it, but not because it's good, if that makes sense. Anyway, Road Queen. Road Queen is a staple if you are playing Valkyries. So if you're going to play Valkyries, and Valkyries is a great budget deck, I recommend crafting Road Queen for Valkyries. Outside of that, no. Just because it's not the general purpose kind of rare that's going to go in a large number of decks. As I said before, Lore Broker is the kind of card I just throw in almost every blue deck I make. Road Queen here, arguably more powerful, definitely more powerful in the deck it's intended to be in, which is Valkyries. But if you're not going to be playing that deck, I wouldn't recommend crafting it. So Seahaven. I go back and forth on this because it's very powerful. Being able to give something agile is a big deal. Being able to give something armor 2, and 2 again is that magic number, is also a very big deal, because that means that whatever you put on this will survive things like Thunderclap and Magnus and Ignitions and so on and so forth. Seahaven, I think, is a bit actually underrated in the meta right now. It's a very good card, but I usually only find myself playing it in either aggressive or mid-rangey blue lists. It just never makes the cut in my control lists, because I'm more trying to put in reactive tools than ways to protect my own bodies, if that makes sense. So I guess I would say I would recommend consider crafting one of them to try it out and see if you like it. As I said, if you play aggressive lists, if you play mid-range lists, throwing one in is not going to hurt you in many cases, and I'm a big fan. I actually think it's very underrated right now, but the issue is it's not like super broad in its applications like, say, Foss Grimm or Lore Broker is. Next up, this is arguably like the must craft blue rare. This is Thunderclap, and this is why that 2 damage mark is so important, because if you're playing against blue, you have to assume they have Thunderclap, and so you've got to find a way to get your stuff to survive Thunderclap. Just deals 2 damage to everything that your opponent has, but that's good enough. It's very, very strong. You will see it in every blue deck. If you are going to play blue, this is a must craft. This is, as I said, in my opinion, like the #1 blue rare, because you're going to put it in absolutely everything. Next up we have Draugar. I've heard it pronounced a number of ways, and I'm going to be honest, I don't personally know which one is correct, so I'm just going to go with Draugar for now. But this card is okay. If it didn't have to be played opposite an enemy minion, this card I think would see a lot more play, but that's actually a significant drawback. You get a lot of stats, and it's got overrun, which is also really nice, but you run into situations where, like, your ideal scenario is to play this across something like a snake. And yes, it fully heals when an enemy minion dies, but that 4 health, by the time that this is coming down at 5 magicka, that 4 health is not nearly as impressive as it might seem to be. So it's okay. Like, I've played it in decks just as like a space filler, but this is not what I would consider to be a must craft, and you will not see many of these on the ladder. Alright, next up is Shatterfist. And this is a card that does see play. I don't think it's a must craft, but it definitely sees play in some mid-range lists. I think people see the drawback, if you will, that fragile 1, and it kind of scares them a bit, but 9 health is a lot of health. And the reality is that 9 health, even with fragile 1, it has the potential to be as big as, you know, if your first thing hits for 7, then you technically take 8, and then any next hit kills it, right? So it's almost like it has 8 health if it takes exactly 2 hits. Even if it takes a number of hits, right? Like, let's say it gets repeatedly dealt 1 damage to maximize the brutality of the fragile 1. This is still effectively a 3/5 at that point, but it's also got a lot of room to heal because of the 9 health, and the fact that it gets that +2/+0 after each time it takes damage is also pretty relevant. The fact that it has overrun is pretty relevant. I guess what I'm trying to say is, don't let that fragile 1 fool you. This card is better than it looks. You will run into it. You will see it played against you, but I don't consider it a must craft because it's not so powerful that you can't live without it, and it's not so versatile. You run it in every blue deck, and if I'm being honest, you know, Crimson Pact still kind of wrecks it pretty hard, so it's got some drawbacks, but the fragile 1 is not actually the biggest drawback there. Next up is Allfather's Horn. This card is very powerful, and if you are going to be playing a lot of blue aggro or mid-range, I would recommend crafting at least 1. I'm not 100% convinced that this is always going to be a 2 of index, but if you have an aggressive list, you probably want this as a 1 of. It is super powerful. Essentially, because it gives a standard action, it's like allowing everything on your board to attack twice. And then because you also get to refresh your mana and gems, You can play Allfather's Horn and then still follow it up with additional things like combat tricks as well. But like this is like a it's like almost getting to take two different turns, except for you don't draw cards. It's really powerful. If you've ever been hit with an Allfather's Horn, it hurts. Even if it's just to make one creature attack one more time, sometimes that can be the difference between a win or a loss. So I think having at least one in your repertoire, if you're going to be playing blue, makes sense, and specifically aggressive decks and mid-rangey decks where you're going to have a lot of bodies or potentially some big bodies, you're going to like Allfather's Horn. Cataclysm. This one's pretty straightforward. Very powerful card. It's even been nerfed since the alpha. It's still really powerful. This is a must craft if you're going to play blue control. And outside of that, you can kind of ignore it. You're not going to play this in aggressive lists. I've seen a couple of mid-range lists include it as a one-of, just because it can either be a panic button or a finisher because it deals 5 damage to players as well. But most of the time, this is just an additional board sweep in your control decks, and rightfully so. So if you're going to play control, craft it for sure. Otherwise, I wouldn't recommend crafting it, but be aware that this exists because you'll get hit with it and it hurts. Next up is Triassic Kraken. This is a card that, much like Maelstrom, I personally enjoy and I try to make work far more than is necessary because I like Krakens. But I can't recommend crafting this. And the reason I can't recommend crafting this is because as a new player, your essence is very important, and there's just a budget option that is arguably just better than this card anyway. Don't get me wrong, the regen 3 is very relevant. A 6/6 for 6 is fine. The all enemy minions are immobile sometimes matters, but the reality is when you compare this card to something like Hyperborean, which at the same cost gives you Overrun and a 6/8, a lot of decks are going to prefer Hyperborean, so I can't recommend crafting it, even though I love it. It's just not worth it right now. Last up, technically this is a dual colored card, but since we don't have a way to filter by dual colored cards specifically, we're just going to include them as they pop up in the color that they burn for. So if you're a new player and you don't understand when there's 2 gems available and you burn one of these, the color that goes around this number is the color it burns for. So this card burns for a blue. It's basically considered a blue card even though it requires gems from multiple colors. So we're going to review it in the blue cards, and this card gets a 10 out of 10 for being a good boy, because he's a good boy, but just does not see play. In my experience, I have not even seen this really get played in enchantment heavy decks. It's a lot of stats, right? It is 2 for a 4/4 in stats if it's occupying an enchantment, and then that's not counting if the enchantment gives it stats. Like you could drop this on, you know, a giant's enchantment, for example, the one that gives +3/+3, and then suddenly you've paid 2 to get a 7/7. But all it takes is for any player to use a power, then this gets bounced. And sometimes that's a benefit. You can play this, and if they don't use a power on their turn, then you can attack, get a value trade, and then bounce it back to your hand. It's really mana intensive for you to get value out of it, and typically what ends up happening is like you're just kind of reducing the mana of both players. Like you play this for 2 and they use their power for 2 and it bounces back, and you might have this like dance where you do that back and forth, but I don't know, it's just not good enough. And usually, again, because this really gets its benefit when it's occupying an enchantment. If you're playing an enchantment heavy deck, you typically don't have the extra mana just lying around because you've already had to take some tempo losses to develop your enchantments, and you're not really in a position where you can keep doing that over and over. So it just doesn't see a lot of play. I don't recommend crafting it, but it is still a good boy, and as such gets a 10 out of 10 in my book. And that's it for the blue rares. As I said, I'm going to do this for each of the colors just to kind of go through and talk about each of the cards as far as kinds of decks you would use them in, if you use them at all, whether they're worth your time for crafting. And again, I'm going with the all-purpose general usage standpoint there. As I said before, cards like Thunderclap, cards like Foss Grimm, these are cards that you're going to use in a lot of decks. So I can recommend just, crafting them safely. Other cards like Road Queen, for example, very, very good, and in the deck that they belong in, a staple. But if you're a new player and you're not specifically building Valkyries, then don't craft Road Queen. You know what I mean? So anyway, if you made it this far, I appreciate you. Thanks for watching, and I hope to catch you in the next video.